Hello, and welcome to our Twig woodworking workshop with our UO Craft Center. My name is Tiffany Fritz, and I'm the Director of Parent and Family Programs. In just a moment, I will introduce our instructors. During this session, we've asked families to engage with their creative side. And so if you are tuning in and watching this after the fact, we've got a lot of good stuff in store for you. And with that, David, I will turn it over to you and let things get started.
Great, thank you so much. My name is David Wagner. I am one of the assistant directors here at the Craft Center, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very excited to do this. We've been doing a few virtual workshops here and there, but as you can imagine, virtual craft workshops are kind of a conundrum. And so we're working it out as we go every time. Terrence has done a few of these already so far over the last year, and he's gotten pretty good at it. So I'm excited. I haven't gotten to sit in on one yet, and I'm excited to see what he does. So I'll turn it over then to Terrence.
No pressure then, huh?
No pressure.
Hi, I'm Terrence. I'm the other assistant director here at the Craft Center. And we really enjoy doing the Parents Weekend. Usually though, I get to hang out in the background and assist while other people do workshops with lots of parents coming through. So this is all new to us in that regard, but it's something we really like to, it's one of our best ways to reach students, quite honestly. If parents come and do something with us and go, you need to go back over there and do this cool things that we saw and did together. So I'm just really glad that people have come. We've got a few participants in here now. This is Twig Woodworking. We started out this class, I started to teach this class 15 years ago, and then it got sidetracked and we never got back to it until here we were in pandemic times, and we were trying to teach from my garage and wanted something accessible to students who were in their garage instead of here at the Craft Center where we wanted them to be. So I started looking into what can you do with what you have on hand? And that naturally kind of led to this when they said, do you want to do a workshop for Parents Weekend? And we said, yes. So I'm going to give you a real quick overview. There's no way in the time we have we can cover everything there is to know. But I'm going to give you a rundown on how to put some sticks together. And really, when we told you that we'd be using sticks from our yard, we weren't kidding. These are branches cut from my backyard an hour ago, maybe a little bit longer. As we're going forward, it's going to be a little bit tricky if you just shout out questions, although we don't have a huge number of people here. So if you have a question that can't wait, go ahead and unmute yourself and give us that question. If you have a question that you're just trying to get a sense of what you want to ask, go ahead and type it in the chat and David can get my attention. Reason being, I'm going to be looking down, and if it comes up in the chat window, I won't see it go by unless I flip the camera back up and makes our what appears to be a high-tech setup really evident that it's not. There's packing tape involved in the way that this is held together right now. So we're going to start just by talking about wood a little bit, because there's a few things you need to understand about wood and how it grows in order to start putting it together so that it doesn't break and frustrate you. And the last thing we want to do is teach you something that then becomes very frustrating. I don't know how much experience anybody has, and this is the point in a live class where I'd always be like, okay, I want to tell you about me, then you tell me about you, and then we'll figure out where we're at and go from there. Zoom's terrible for this, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, and if you have thoughts, comments, things you want to tell me about where you're coming from with woodworking, what you're interested in seeing in the time we have, feel free to either just reach out or type into the chat, and David will find a good time to slip that in and say, hey, so-and-so had a question, and we'll see if we can do this. We've never done it before, so if we get it all wrong, we're learning just like everybody else. So everybody in school, right, learned that if you cut a tree down, it leaves a stump. Can you see that at all?
No.
Fine point dry erase, which is not going to be my friend. Can you see that at all?
Much better.
Can you see? All right. So, and when you cut through that log, there's rings, right? Everybody got this in school? Maybe, maybe not. Each one of those rings, you count them up and you can tell how old the tree was, right? And that's how we remember what's going on with wood. When you cut through the wood this way, you see those rings. This is what's called cutting across the grain. If you cut through the wood this way, you don't see those rings. You see the line patterns that we're used to seeing when we look at wood and paneling and things like that, that allow us to think of it as wood. And we think of both of these as wood, right? But this is across the grain and this is with the grain. And it's the way that the tree grows. So we say each year it puts on a growth ring. That's true everywhere except at the equator. At the equator, you get the same temperature all year round. So you get growth rings, but they don't necessarily equate to years. But everywhere here in North America, any North American hardwoods you're looking at, if you see those rings, you can count them up or softwood, be pretty clear how old that tree is. Even petrified wood, this is true. So why we want to talk about this is wood is stronger in some dimensions than other, and it moves more in some dimensions than other. So if you think about that tree again that we've cut down, it's kind of a sad picture. Try for a better dry erase marker here that you can see, or I'm going to stop drawing pictures. Tree, growth rings. This tree puts on these rings by adding on to the outside as the year goes on. So the oldest part of the tree is kind of in the middle and the newer layers are outside. And each year it puts on a sap ring where the sap travels up and down the tree. And then the next year that becomes part of the interior of the tree and a new sap ring grows on the outside. The tree gets bigger and taller, but more growth in diameter usually than height proportionally. When we think about the tree, trees breathe on an annual scale. So once every year, the tree goes, oh, and it fills up with sap, and that all runs up into the tree and fills it up. It's when you get your maple syrup, that all comes up through the tree at that point. At the end of the year, the tree dies back, and it contracts, and all the moisture leaves the tree, and it gets dry and brittle, and the leaves fall off if it's a deciduous tree. But basically, over the course of the year, the tree does this. It takes a long time, but it's like breathing. That continues to be true of wood pretty much forever. If you think about getting a piece of wood that you have on your house or furniture wet, it will swell almost immediately, and it will crack, and it will make kind of a mess. It can sometimes be salvaged, but sometimes the absorption of moisture is so dramatic that it breaks the piece of furniture. So wood moves. And what we need to remember when we're designing any kind of furniture at all, if you're using solid wood, wood moves. This is now a stick cut out of that tree. We think about those growth rings still being there, right? And then the long grain goes this way. This is a 2x4. This is a piece of construction lumber. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. That is going to still move. And it's going to move mostly in that same direction as if the tree grew. That expands in and out. Doesn't move much in this dimension. But when you buy a wet 2x4, it's going to get smaller. And it's not going to get shorter, but it's going to get smaller in diameter. I just realized that I need to spotlight here. Then I can see what I'm doing. You can see what I'm doing. Every day I learn more about Zoom. You'd think after a year I'd have it down. The reason this is relevant to twig furniture is you are, unlike most other furniture, using the whole twig at any given time. Twig furniture is a general term. Today, I am going to literally be building with twigs, but it applies even to when you see log furniture, like cabins and stuff that are made out of whole chunks of tree. That is also called twig furniture. It's the style of construction, not necessarily the type of material. So this can be a log or a branch or whatever. And twig furniture mostly describes taking this log or branch, cutting it to a length, and then putting a hole through it and taking another log or branch and tapering it to where it goes through that hole and comes out the other side. And then that can be glued, it can be cut and wedged so that it's locked in there. It can be put together a lot of ways, but this is kind of our basic construction module for twig furniture. There are ways to do this with square tenons and square holes, but it's not common, and it kind of gets into more of a complex joinery at that point. The principle is the same, but it's a lot harder to do. What we're going to do today, I'm going to try to do it the simplest tools I can. If anybody got the email, it said you might want a pruning saw, a stout knife, some other things in there, some sort of drill. Drills are important to making holes. You can absolutely do it by hand just by taking a nail and digging your way through the branch, but it's really, really slow. I don't recommend it. I'm going to mostly use these guys today because they're fast and we're in a hurry, but this is also a great time for one of these. You may have seen them in antique stores, or you might have grown up using one. It's entirely possible. It's called a brace and bit. Well, this is the brace, and then the bit goes in the brace. And that's the type of bit that they have. A lot of times people will see these bits and they don't know what they go to. They still show up in people's garages all the time. That little screw at the end means that it's for using with a manual drill, not a power drill. If you try to use a power drill with this, it will smoke the bit in no time flat. But it's called a follow screw, and it allows the drill bits to thread into the wood. So it's basically like driving a screw with a screwdriver. They make screwdriver attachments for these too. Old technology. Much the same way we use screw tips in these, you can put one in one of those. But generally we're going to be using speed bits. You want a wood bit for the most part, but whatever you have will work. I don't have a pointed bit for my smallest bit. I've just got a regular metalworking bit. This is called a brad point bit. And the other ones that people have around a lot, not these guys, these guys. These are called spade bits, and you see them all the time at the hardware store. They're not expensive, and they are not ideal for a lot of situations. Many people get them and go, why did I buy these terrible bits? They are fantastic for this, especially in a power drill situation. They will put a hole right through a branch without any trouble whatsoever. So if you have a set of those, or you pick up a set for $6 or $7, that is a great bit for drilling through a branch instead of using something big and expensive that bends easy like this. This is a great bit as well, but it's going to be, this is not going to last actually as long as these cheap spade bits will for drilling into, especially wet wood. So I've got some examples here of wood that's been put together this way, and you'll see it's just a branch that has been tapered down and fit through another branch. And this is the beginning of something like a chair or stool. It's not up to really human scale yet, but if we put this together, it would probably be strong enough to hold me up. It's a little less stout than I would like it to be for somebody my size, but it will work. This wood has been cut for about 6 months, I would guess. It is much lighter than this stuff that I just brought in, and it's just water. It has shed its water, it has shrunk a little bit in diameter, and it's not quite as tight as it was when I first put it together. I could probably pop this back apart now, but when I first did it, it locked up really well. Oh, it's wedged on one side, but not the other, and that's the side that's moving. So we'll keep that back to show you putting a wedge in that when we're done. This is a non-measuring style of construction. You could be as obsessive as you want to be about measuring everything out exactly and doing a bunch of math. I tend to approach this as about that long, about that big a hole, and I cheat a lot when I'm laying out what I'm doing. So I'm going to do, just for the sake of getting going, I'm going to do one joint about the size of one of these, just so you see how we get there, and then we'll start talking about how you assemble something out of it. You can use any kind of saw for this if you have them handy and they're big enough. I took this off with a regular pair of limbing loppers. Those work great for cutting your stuff to length. They give you a pretty nice clean end. This is laurel wood. Many people have it as a hedge. What I have used to be a hedge. It's now 30-foot trees, and I'm trying to get it cut back to where it's a hedge again. So you can clean up pretty quickly with a pair of bypass shears to get rid of all your extra, up to a certain scale. Once you hit a certain point, then you're going to need a saw, but all the little stuff can come right off just with pruning shears. And if you're working any smaller than this, you can probably do all your length cutting with something like this. If you've got smaller pieces, we could probably just be like, I guess I want it to be about that long. Watch your fingers, but watch your fingers at every stage of the game. Ideally, your tools for this should be really sharp. Most people's are not, and that's okay. But if you get into this, you're going to want to get something good and sharp. The reason that I said in the write-up not to use a really good sharp kitchen knife is because they're hard to sharpen and their edges are fairly small and brittle. If you have something more like an outdoor knife, or this is a Scandinavian carving knife. A lot of what people buy now called bushcraft knife, an outdoor knife, is the same big flat grind. It's a very stable edge. It can be honed super sharp, and it'll cut through most of this like butter. So it'll cut right through there. And that's what we're going to be doing to shape the ends. You can do that with a knife or with a chisel, or with some other tools as we go along. But let's pick a length and go with it. Everybody's got different saws available to them. I have brought a bunch of different saws that you might have around and to look at. This is a hacksaw. It's usually for cutting metal. It'll cut wood just fine. You can even buy wood cutting blades for them. This is a traditional European style back saw. A lot of people have one of these kicking around. This is not as fine as what's called a dovetail saw. It's a good saw for just lopping branches. Traditional European push saw. This is what most people have kicking around the garage somewhere. It's going to work fine. This is my tool of choice. This is a Japanese dovetail saw. The blades are replaceable, and really good ones can run you hundreds of dollars. This is probably about a $40 saw, not a $400 or $500 hand set tooth saw. But this is actually closest, if you look at the edge there, you can see it. This is closest to what we're mostly selling in this country as a pruning saw now, which makes perfect sense to what we're doing. And if you happen to have like a Fiskars pruning saw, they're designed just like this to cut on the pull stroke, to cut through green softwood really quickly, and they will work just fine. If you think about what we're dealing with, a pruning saw makes perfect sense. If your wood has gotten real dry, it might not cut that cleanly, but this is still very, very wet. It's very soft at this point. It doesn't have the hardness you get from it drying out. It's still squishy, really. So I'm going to cut myself a length.
Parents, I want to jump in and point out, I got one of these saws at the local hardware store for $20. And I use it literally as my only saw now. It's
I have
around the house.
I always tell myself I'm going to buy a pruning saw, and I have several of these, and I just haven't because I've been using the same one. Well, I've got one of these that's missing half its teeth, and it's still the saw I reach for every time I want to take a branch off carefully. It's fine enough that it doesn't cut super fast. A good pruning saw will cut quicker than this through wet softwood. But so I've got a vise, and it's not by any means impossible to do it without one, but it sure helps to have one. If you don't have a vise, you can get much the same effect by just getting yourself a C-clamp or a bar clamp like this and clamping your piece of wood directly to the surface and then cutting from there. But if you have a vise of some kind, that can be a great way to go. They sell add-on vices now that are like a wood vise like this that you just bolt down to your table, or any kind of vise you may have, as long as you can get your piece of wood into it, it's going to work. A lot of people have metalworking vices more than woodworking vices. The only thing that you want to think about there is that wood vices don't damage the surface of your wood. Clearly, I'm going for a rustic effect here, but if I have big, gnarly metal tooth marks in this, I'm going to notice. So if you're going to do that, you can wrap a piece of fabric around your piece of wood, put that in the metal vise before you close it down, and that'll keep it from doing a bunch of damage to the bark if you're going to keep the bark on. If you're going to take the bark off, go ahead and clamp it and do your work and then take the bark off afterwards, and all of that damage will be removed. How obsessive you get about cleanup is kind of up to you. Some people want to leave branches on there. So they're going to want to make their stool, but they're going to want to leave a couple of little twigs sticking off there so it really looks like a branch. Other people are going to want to really clean it up and have a finished quality to it. You can do that by coming over your little stubs here where the branches grew and just shaving them down, so they're nice and smooth. And you can take it as far as you want to take it. Is anybody actually following along with tools trying to do this? Because I'm probably going too fast, but I'm just going to clean those up real quick so you see what that looks like. Nice about that is it gives you a lovely little window onto the tree itself, and you can see those growth rings again in the branches where you've shaved that down. And you can take it smooth right to the surface, or you can leave it sticking out a little bit. Again, this wood is super soft because it is so very, very wet and so very, very green. If I take a piece of this, this is very similar wood, but if I go to cut that knot off right now, oh yeah, much more resistant. This is much older. It will still cut, but it is good and dry now. So you can see here where I did that one back when it was green, and it's now super slick and shiny because it shrank. So it's even smoother than it was when I cut it. But when I go back to try and do this other one now, it's taking a little bit of force. It'll still work, absolutely, but it's not as smooth and easy as if the branch is fresh cut, which is why I ran home and cut some wood before we did this, so that I wouldn't be scraping at it like that. But you absolutely can. I also love to use this madrone because it drops branches all the time. I don't have to cut anything. I can walk through the park, pick up a couple of branches and take them home with me. And it's super hard. So you can absolutely do stuff with dry wood. This has not got any moisture content left to it, and you can still work it over pretty quickly and get a surface you like. So the way that I measure out for this sort of a project is I use the drill bit that I'm going to drill through with to mark the end of my tenon. So the hole is called a mortise. So I've got my stick and my non-functional expo marker. I've got my stick, which is right there. The hole that goes through it is called a mortise, whether it's round or square. And the piece that goes in there is called the tenon. And the tenon is usually mostly straight with a slight taper so that it kind of socks into the joint at the very back end. And then what we're going to do is once we put it through, we're going to cut a wedge in the end, and we're going to put a little piece of wood back in there that flares it out a little bit. So instead of going straight through there, it's actually slightly tapered going in that way, and then coming out the other way, it's slightly tapered, and that locks it together. So let's see if we can't do that. I'm going to take my drill, and I'm going to figure out where my two pieces of wood are going together and the angle I want them to go together at. I highly recommend that when you start out with your first couple, just do them at 90 degrees to get a sense of what it looks like and not really worry about it. And I would just put a few sticks together. I wouldn't try to build a piece of furniture right away, do something like this. And that pretty quickly expands to where you're making some sort of little table or chair pretty natural. You start putting things together and seeing how it works pretty quickly. This, I'm going to put a hole right through the middle of, just like the example I showed you. You can either put it in the vise vertically. I like to put it in the vise horizontally, but however you can get it to stay in one spot. If you don't have a vise, you can pin it down to a surface with your hand or use a clamp to hold it in place. I kind of look at this point for the most aesthetically pleasing side that I want out. You don't have to, but if I'm making a chair out of this, I don't want to hide these smooth knots. I want those to be on the outside corner of my leg or whatever it is. So I'm going to go at 90 degrees to those so that those are on the outside. Totally personal aesthetic choice. You might want those knots to be completely hidden.
Parents, I would assume also that if there's some kind of shape to the branch, if it's not entirely straight, you might want to consider that as part of it. Is that?
Absolutely. So for this, mostly what I do is average. So that hole is drilled through at an angle based on the average line through this. I could also decide that that's my line, right? That my leg is going to sit at that angle, but I'm thinking of it as a straight piece that's got a curve in the middle of it. So the way that this hole was drilled, it's drilled straight through what to my eye looks like the middle. You can absolutely use different shaped pieces. This is another piece of the madrone. It's got no straight sections at all, but we could still cut this into pieces and make some sort of a stool out of it. I don't know what yet. I haven't decided. It's been sitting around here for a while because it's such a pretty color. Balance it there. So I'm going to drill that hole with this drill bit. I'm not going to obsess about it greatly. I'm just going to drill straight through. There it is. It's just a hole. Nothing more exciting than that. What's nice about it when it's really green like this is that the bark doesn't shatter off. If you look at that piece of madrone that was drilled when it was dry, the bark kind of cracks off around there. Now the bark's still so wet, it didn't even really clean out of the way. I need to clean that up a little bit with a knife if I wanted it to be totally clean. Now is where I'm going to start cheating. I'm going to take the piece I want to put into that. I don't know which one it is, maybe this one. And I'm going to cut my length. We're going to make it that long. And then I want to make that tenon exactly the same size as that hole. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to take my drill bit and I'm going to put the point of the drill bit right in the middle of my piece of wood. I'm going to drill a super shallow hole in the end, just like that. That is now how big my tenon needs to be. If you wanted to do it a little bit more technically, you could put this piece right up against that one, make yourself a really long skinny pencil and draw through. That'll work. You can use a sharp nail to go through there and draw a hole that way, but I like to just make that little mark on the end. And then I make my tenon just long enough that I can cut that back off when I'm done. But again, personal aesthetic choices. This doesn't have a lot of the rules that other furniture techniques have. You can choose to do it however you want. Again, this wood, super soft. You can see how deep that cut just in one cut. A knife like this should be super sharp. I readily admit that this is mine and it is not as sharp as this knife could be. So this wood is super, super soft.
Since we're doing home techniques right now, I have to share my exciting new discovery. I know it's not actually a new discovery, people do it for centuries, but the bottom of a porcelain cup or a flower pot or something like that makes a surprisingly excellent knife sharpener. I just sharpened my pocket knife with this, and it's sharper than it has been with my kitchen sharpener. It took like 2 minutes and I got a really nice edge on it. It's the unglazed portion of the bottom of a cup.
I did not know this trick, but I can see myself using this trick.
Oh my gosh, it's amazing. I was so blown away. It was like, because I don't want to have a $120 set of whetstones at home. I won't use them.
I do.
I'll use the coffee mug that's sitting right in front of me.
So really quickly, that's come down to where I'm just a little bit bigger than my mark. And then I'm going to figure out how long it needs to be by holding the one up to the other. And I need to come back a little bit further. I'm going to take it back just behind that little knot there. And that's the length I need to reach through there. And then I'll start shaving it a little more carefully to fit. And I'm using a sweeping motion with the knife. What's nice about having this real stiff backed knife is that it's not going to flex. I can just turn it like that. There are absolutely advantages to a knife that flexes, but it's not my favorite for doing this.
You can also use other tools for this. This is my favorite tool for doing this on a small scale. On a bigger scale, I like to use a draw knife. Draw knife is like a knife with two handles. I have one here. This is a really little one. I like bigger ones than this, but for this sort of stuff, this would be great. So it's a little super sharp knife, handles on each side, works great when you put your wood in a vise. Does have to be held fairly firmly to work, but these, we just got this at the hardware store, I think, and they show up all the time in antique stores. They're usually used with what's called a shaving horse, which is, it's got a pivoting head and you put your feet against it and the head comes down when you put your feet against it and that locks your piece of wood in place. So you can keep turning it without having to undo the vise. You just lift your foot, make a couple of cuts, lift your foot, make a couple of cuts as you turn it. This, I got to do a little bit and then turn the vise, clamp it again. So this is another tool that's just great for doing this. And this is cutting so fast, but I just overcut that pretty dramatically. I would have to back up at this point and take a little bit off the end to make it not be too small. But that's part of why I start with a taper, and then once I'm at the right size, then I come back and bring it all to that same size within reason. One of the advantages of doing it this way is that your cut is not perfectly smooth. If you look at that, you know, it's fairly straight and even, but it's got quite a bit of texture. As the wood shrinks around it, it's going to grab and hold tighter because it's not totally smooth. If it's totally smooth, it'll spin. If it's not totally smooth, once it dries a little bit, it's going to lock on there. So I'm just cleaning up my bark here a little bit so I can see how close I am to that going. It's almost ready to go in there. I'm going to take just a little bit more, and then we should be able to fit that through. And this is all just by eye. There's no careful measurement beyond the it didn't fit. So I'm coming back, and that's where I've got that line from my drill bit. I have not quite cut all the way to it, and now I'm going to do that. I'm going to, especially right at the tip, I'm going to cut it right to that line. Anybody have questions so far? It's so very, very quiet.
Feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask a question or jump into the chat, and I will be happy to relay stuff to Terrence as well.
Otherwise, Dave is going to start asking questions, and it'll be,
oh man, and it's going to get bad.
Pump the chumps. I'm going to be the chump.
I like to wander into the middle of Terrence's workshops and start bantering, and we can go for hours. So you guys better speak up.
Just taking a little bit more. It's really close to fitting. And I'm just trying to keep it nice and straight, except right here at the shoulder. And there are two different ways to approach this. A lot of times you see with contemporary twig furniture exactly that shape where it tapers down to where it fits. And that's what kind of socks it up tight against there. The other way to do it is to put a shoulder on it so that it sits flush against that surface and the two pieces mate smoothly. That takes more work, so you see it less often, but it's actually slightly stronger. But that fits. I mean, that goes in and out of there without any problem. At this point, because both of these pieces of wood were cut today, they should shrink at roughly the same rate. If I were being obsessive, which I am sometimes, but if I were being obsessive right now, I would cut all of my tenons just a little bit big today, and I wouldn't drill any of my holes for a couple of days. That gives this a chance to dry out for a couple of days before I fit it to that hole, meaning it's already ahead of the game when I put it in, meaning long-term it's going to shrink slightly less than this one's going to shrink, meaning it's going to lock on there even harder. Not something to worry about when you're just playing, but if you think about getting your tenons done a little bit too big a couple of days in advance and then shaving them down to fit after they've shrunk for a couple of days, they will always be slightly more shrunk than that. Made no sense. So that's about what we want that to fit like. It should be a nice snug fit. It shouldn't be loose, but it shouldn't take every speck of strength I've got. Or, you know, if you find yourself reaching for the big hammer, like I'm gonna pound that in there, that's probably too much. Although, you know, sometimes you do need to persuade the wood to go where you want it to. So for this one, I've got enough coming through that I can happily wedge that without any problem. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that out of there. It fits great. I am going to put it back in my vise, and I'm going to cut a careful, totally random little triangle out of the top. So this, we only want this to be a couple of degrees. So I'm basically just gonna cut it mostly straight down the middle. I'm not gonna try to cut a big V into it or anything. Just cutting straight down the middle, not getting my fingers in the way of that blade because, man, these are sharp. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can make a wedge, but if you look at these pieces that are coming off there when I'm cutting them, they really are just pretty much exactly the right shape. Only problem is that those are too soft, but if I can get a wedge like that off of one of my pre-dried pieces of wood, it's going to work great. Or we can split a wedge out of another piece of wood. So one of the things to think about with making wood this way, or making things out of wood this way, is that if you take your piece of wood, it has a ton of strength this way. If I try to break it like that, I can pound on it all day long and nothing's going to happen. But you've all seen or split firewood. If I hit it like this, it's going to break right down the grain. It's much less strong in that capacity. So I can get a lot of mileage out of that. So I can take a piece of wood that's already been split. So this was just a chunk of log, piece split off of that chunk of log. You can still see the grain rings going through here. This is white oak that came off my wood pile. This is another piece that's been split off of that. And to get a wedge out of here, I can just keep splitting that down. I can do it with a knife. I can do it with a chisel. Chisel might be a little bit better for this. I'm using these words without explaining it. This is a chisel. You've probably already all heard of something chisel shaped or seen or used a chisel at some point. This is a simple tool. It's a cutting tool. We often think about, you know, they use chisels in masonry as well, and then it's a smashing tool. This is a cutting tool. It should be sharp enough to shave with. This one's not quite because it's a shop chisel, but it should be really, really sharp. We're going to use it in this case just to split a piece of wood. In fact, I'm going to use one that's even duller because I'm really using it as a wedge. If you're splitting out of a log, you're going to use something like that. This is a splitting wedge. This is way too big for what we're doing. But a dull chisel is pretty much the same shape. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to use some sort of a mallet like this to encourage the wood to do what it wants to do anyway. It's not taking a ton of force. Last time I did this, I had to mute because I only had a hammer and it was really loud. But hopefully that's not too pummeling on your end. You can see how quickly we can get a piece of wood out of that that is remarkably board-like. I'm now going to take another piece off there that'll be pretty thin. Maybe.
I'm going to mention about chisels that I was totally intimidated by woodworking chisels that are 20 to hundreds of dollars each. But I have a 1-inch hardware store chisel that cost me, I think, $8 at home that I got pretty sharp and that works great for this kind of stuff.
Yep. It's totally worth it if you're going to do a lot of it to buy expensive chisels. However, I have several of these cheap Stanley chisels. This is a shop chisel again, not one of mine, but I have several of these that I use all the time. I mean, all the time. And I get them not as sharp as I get my fine joinery chisels, but sharp enough to do the job. And for what I'm using this for, I'm using it as a splitting tool, not as a fine woodworking tool. I'm just going to take that little piece of wood that I've split off of my main piece of wood, and I'm going to kind of cut it across the grain with my knife, because we're down to toothpick sort of size here now. This is not a
big piece of wood. Started it with that, and then I'm going to find my sharp chisel. I did have one here. Here it is. And I'm going to use that to take that the rest of the way through. So what I've got is a little piece of hardwood. It's tapered on the end, and I'm going to use that to pin this together. I've cut a little slot in the end of that, and I'm going to widen it out just a little bit more. But basically, I'm just going to make another cut right next to that one. I'm not going to do much more than that. This is so soft. Again, because it's fresh. A lot of the woods that you cut in your yard are great for this and make nice little bits of furniture. So lilac wood has to be pruned back every year. That's a great one for this. It's real soft to work with when you first mess with it, but then it really dries in a nice, hard, dense wood. Maples, absolutely great wood for making furniture out of.
Thinking a little more about tools, I did want to point out another saw option that I think would work really well for this is the little X-Acto knife saws, which are not super high quality, but would give you a great deal of control at these really small kind of cuts. And again, hobby store kind of stuff for just a few dollars. Nothing you have to invest too much in.
Somehow I had lost the one that was supposed to go through and I had the wrong one. I was like, nothing fits anymore. Slow down a bit when you're doing this from the rate I'm going at it. So something to think about here. If you can see the little notch I made in the edge there. And we just saw the way I split that wood by driving something down the grain. So when I put my wedge in, if I drive my wedge into the grain that way, I might split my whole piece. So I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees. So I'm driving it this way, which is putting my force that way, which is much, much stronger and not going to split. Does that make sense? I'm going to just take my little wedge. I'm going to put that tapered edge right into the slot I cut, and I'm going to grab my mallet. This mallet's too big. I'm going to use it anyway. I'm just going to tap it down in there. You can see already how much that's flaring out. It's no longer round. And I'm not going to overdrive it. I don't want to make it incredibly big. But again, this wood is so soft that that is now flared out dramatically from where it was. I can leave it like that if I like that look. It's a nice look to see how it was put together. Or I can come back and cut that off flush. But it's not going anywhere now. That is on there. And if it's feels like it's not on there well, push it on a little bit further, tap the wedge a little bit further. This wedge is a little bit meaty because I'm operating under pressure. I wish I'd made it a little bit thinner, but again, that's aesthetic. It's not going to come off there the way we've done it. So I'm going to go ahead, just for the sake of showing you, I'm going to cut right through the end of the tenon, right through the wedge, as long as I'm not cutting below the wedge.
Now, you were talking about the fact that it's going to lock in a bit when it dries. Would you want to wait until it's drier to cut that off potentially, or is it fine to cut it?
Should shrink proportionally, but it's a good question. That would be something I would experiment with if you're going to do much of this. I'm going to go ahead and take this all the way flush. That was just cutting it close with the saw. But I didn't want to mess up my bark. If again, you're going to peel it, then don't worry about it. I'm going to try to leave the bark fairly intact. So I'm going to finish this off either with a knife or a chisel. Actually, I think what I want is my little draw knife guy here. That was sure cutting nice a minute ago. Oh yeah. Only thing to watch out for cutting this with something real sharp is that that piece of dry oak I put in the middle may chip a little bit more than the softwood, so you want to cut carefully so you don't break it as you go across there. It's funny because it's on there really solid, but the wood is so soft and flexible still that the whole thing is moving. You can kind of see what that looks like, and that is on there good and solid in less than an hour. You're doing okay for time. Who's got questions so far? Anybody? Anybody questions at all? No questions?
Somebody mentioned in the chat, thanks for going through tools and how the wood changes when it dries. It seems like, from my limited experience, the moisture in the wood in this case is going to be one of your biggest factors.
Absolutely.
And
So this is what's referred to as green woodworking. We're calling it twig furniture because that's the type of furniture we're making, but green woodworking is its own little animal. It's the first style of woodworking I ever did. Well, I did some stuff, with my grandfather in the shop when I was a kid, but the first college level woodworking class I had, I never really introduced myself and did that whole spiel. But the first college woodworking class I had was green woodworking, and we were given about a 1 foot diameter section of oak tree out of which we made fine furniture. And it's a process of splitting it out when the wood is very, very wet. And you can take what's called a froe and splitting wedges and break pieces of wood out of that long piece of wood, which then have continuous grain because they're broken down the grain, and make that into furniture by carefully drying parts at different rates, drying all of your spindles, rough tapering them, drying your legs less quickly, just drilling the hole, and it's a whole timing process. But because in that case you're using continuous pieces of grain, the grain runs continuously through it, or in this case, because they are round pieces of wood that are intact, they will often dry pretty immaculately. When you get up into bigger rounds of wood, if they dry too quickly from the outside, of course, this one has not a check to show you, but you've all seen on firewood what's called checking, and that's where it dries quicker on the outside surface and less quickly in the middle. And as I said, it shrinks. So what happens is that this circle out here is trying to get small faster than this circle in here, and the only way for it to do that is to break. And that is how you get those big cracks going into the center of a piece of firewood, which makes it easy to split, but it's not necessarily your friend for making furniture out of. The other thing to remember about wood grain direction, since I've got this in front of me, is wood is really strong this way and it's strong this way, but if we cut it here, so I see people do this all the time because it looks cool. If this was a full round and I cut an inch off of that and tried to make it the seat of a stool, there's not enough long grain there to support it. It'll break across that surface. So the whole disc will break into pieces. And it's really sad when you see somebody put a stool together using a round cut from a log so you can count the rings because it looks cool and you know it's going to break. If I wanted to make a stool out of a piece of wood this size, I would turn it into this orientation and put my legs in like that. Does that make sense? Then you're sitting down on this. It's really strong. It's not going to break. That's exactly what we're looking at here on this little model that I did for another class. This was just the legs put together. And then this top is literally just a piece of this chunk of oak split out and shaped down a little bit with a chisel or possibly a hand plane. I don't remember at this time. Same thing here. It's again, another piece of that same little slab of wood just split out. And I do want to emphasize, you don't need to make fairy-sized furniture. You absolutely can, but there's no reason that all of this couldn't be being done with much bigger pieces of wood that we're then putting together into a stool that you can sit on. A lot of what people think of when they hear or talk about twig furniture is framing like this, but then with bent willow fronds on it. And that's just taking thin pieces of wood that are super flexy and bending them while they're still wet. It occurred to me as I was cutting this that laurel is a great one for this because the ends of the branches are so whippy. So I was going to show you that real quick. But all you're doing in that case is you're taking a real flexible section and you can run it between two other areas on your piece of furniture. This is where I really want my little snippers. I have a pair of Fiskars shears that I use for all of my pruning at home that are not, they've got blades on both sides. They're more like scissors. Man, they're great. And they were like $12 25 years ago. I assume you can still buy them because it's Fiskars. I mean, you can still get ads.
They make a great like flower shear now too. There's just the slightly smaller size that would be perfect for this.
Yeah.
They're insanely sharp. I've got a pair at home that I don't know if the kids use.
So I've got a drill bit that is, did I answer your question about wet wood? It is the big factor in this. What makes it easy is that it all cuts real easy. What makes it tricky is that it is still going to shrink. And there's a little bit to learn in there as you mess around with it. But if you think about the fact that it's going to get smaller this way, not this way, that tells you what you need to know. You just need to keep thinking that through as you go. If you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to go ahead and put in a drill bit that is slightly smaller than this. So I'm not even measuring anything at this point. I'm just going to put a couple of holes in that are that diameter. Where am I going to do this? I'm going to do it on this guy. So I've got this, and I'm going to put a couple holes in just freehand. You can get crazy with the vise if you want to. Don't drill into your hand, it hurts. So this is got to be about 3 months since I cut this. It's twice as hard as the other stuff that I've been using today, at least. It's really amazing how those little whippy branches can end up being something solid. So I'm just going to take my little intermediary twig, and I cleaned this up. I've also seen this done with a lot of like branched branches, and you take that branched piece and you drill holes for each one of the branches. But I'm just going to take a piece that's, you know, roughly the distance between those two holes with a little bit of room for it to bend. I'm going to cut this to length. I think I ate the shears. Nope, here they are. And then I'm just going to, by eye, take this down to the diameter of that drill bit. And it's so soft, you got to be careful not to take it too far too fast. And this can be done with red willow is a real common one for this. Any of the willow branches, the weeping willows will work great. But I'm just putting two little ends on it like that, and it's super flexy. I do want to be careful to flex the whole thing, so I don't just grab it and bend it and have it break and have to start over. But again, it's just a little cutoff branch from the rest of this. So if I do, no big loss. So then I'm just going to take that and I'm going to put it into the hole, and I'm going to bend it to the other hole, and I'm going to push it in there. So we got something like that, and you can do that again. And another whipping.
If you like the look of this stuff, I highly recommend going to your local flower shop and asking them for a curly willow cutoff. They use them for just a bouquet kind of filler all the time. You can take any twig of curly willow, stick it in the ground pretty much anywhere in North America, aside from the really arid areas, and it will grow into a tree in a couple of years that will give you all of these branches that you could ever want.
I did not know this.
You'll have to, I mean, they grow like weeds, and you'll have to prune it back all the time. But if you have a little section of your yard that you want to have a small willow tree in, they're kind of pretty.
Well, and I enjoy doing this, and I can't keep up. I mean, I just moved into this house last year, and they let the laurel hedge go for probably 20 years, but I just can't cut it fast enough. So we cut one down to nothing, and it's already a bush that's 3 or 4 feet tall. And I got other ones that are 30 feet tall that I'm trying to get cut back to a hedge height. So I'm hauling this stuff to the yard waste all the time, even though I know it's good for this sort of stuff. I just can't use it all fast enough. So you can see something like that really quickly. You can start to define a bed frame or the side of a chair. You can also bring things up and around. So if you're making a chair, not a chair surface, but if that's your chair, if this comes up above that, say, this is a great way to start coming up and doing the arms of a chair. So you can come up over the top and bend a bunch of those around. You may have seen furniture that's like that to create the arms and the back. attached to that solid twig frame, but then you can start filling in with stuff like that. And there's no reason that it has to be straight line logical either. I actually really like it when it's not. So my degrees are both in sculpture, but I spent a lot of time working in furniture making throughout that time and teaching here and all that good stuff. And so I both really enjoy the highly technical traditional joinery, but I also really like the kind of asymmetric fluidity of this. There's no rules. You can just do what you like. And I've never really been a, fairies of the forest sort of guy, but I kind of want to just make weird chairs and leave them out in the woods. So just to amuse my children, if for no other reason. Two of the people in my the last time I taught this really just wanted to make this little sort of fairy furniture to put out in their yard. I said, okay, let's do that. Somebody else wanted to build a stool out of their firewood and stuff, and that is also totally doable. So there I'm starting to weave them through each other, which can get pretty fun, pretty fast. It also actually, as it dries, will strengthen the structure. As those go from being whippy little things to being twigs, they will still be twigs once they harden up. And that will make a much more rigid structure. Who's got questions? And I'm just going to keep.
Terrence, you answered my question. I was actually going to ask about the wood starting to work with wet wood, and then if it would get stronger or brittle as it dries.
It both, actually. It will get in some ways stronger, but it will also get more brittle. Right now, I can weave these through each other, and I'm doing a totally random back and forth through over and under thing. And this branch is now small enough that it's just going right in the holes. I don't even need to taper it at all. But it will eventually be both stronger, but also more fragile. So it's worth.
So once it's in place, leave it alone.
Yes. It'll easily keep you from falling off the side of the chair, but you wouldn't want to kick it because it'll break.
I think after I put time and energy into it, I wouldn't want to kick it anyway.
Yeah, but children are.
They do like to kick things.
They do. All right, so that's, starting to look like the side of a chair or the back of a chair. Back of a chair would be nice. That you weave enough of those together. And again, it's about scale. So if we use pieces this size, but on a chair human size, and we did enough of them, you could make something strong enough to hold you out of this without any problem. I would want these beams to be bigger, but then these guys here, enough of these will eventually hold you. And if it's something like willow is actually stronger for pieces this size than this stuff is. These are this year's branches. They don't have a growth ring to speak of. They're just a little bit of pith and bark. But willow whips can actually be a couple of years before you cut them, and they'll still be super flexy and totally bendable to do stuff with. So I'm going to show you real quick how you might make a seat out of something. If nobody else has other questions right now. So this is just a piece of firewood, literally off the wood pile. And I am going to try to make a seat out of it. And while I've got it out, I'm going to show you another way to do a tapered end. So this is a Fisker's hatchet from the hardware store. Nothing more exciting than that. It's not a several thousand or several $100 Grand Forth Brooks beautiful hatchet, though those are great and I would love to have one. This is from the hardware store. And I believe David has one just like it. He will vouch for it.
I do, and I just got it sharp enough that I was actually using it the other day to shave little bits off of a stick, and it was sharper than my knife was.
So, like I say, normally you would do this with wedges, but I'm kind of at an intermediate scale. So I'm going to try to do this just with that big dull chisel that I had. And what I'm doing is I'm going to pick a line through here and try to break a board out of this. This is actually called riving. We'll see how it goes. If I was splitting directly off the center, then we'd be splitting it, but it won't necessarily give us a piece of, it gives us a triangular shaped piece of wood. Now you can get a fairly flat triangle that way, that'll work, but I'm just gonna use the hatchet. I think it'll be a little too noisy. If this is too loud, let me know and I'll mute it.
I think it just muted itself on that one.
Did it really?
Sounds like it.
Cool.
Yep.
I've always wondered if it would, but I've never tried. So that's starting to break right down the side there. So I have another dull chisel that I'm going to use as a wedge, though I've buried it underneath all of these branches, every single one of them. So I'm going to use that to kind of continue to follow my line along that log. With any luck, that'll free up my other one. Yep. And you can hear the crack working its way across the piece of wood. Well, you probably couldn't because it probably muted it, but it went crack. So we see that crack is continuing right through the middle and then it's popping out. If it is muting that sound, I'm going to go ahead and use a real wedge here. Let me know if it mutes this, because if it doesn't, it's going to be way too loud for you. Is it muting that?
Still sounds fine to me. If anybody else is having trouble with your speakers, let us know.
Yeah, it's pretty pummeling over here. Let me tell you.
It muted for me too.
Good.
I mean, you hear the first one and then it mutes from there.
Okay.
I can hear you from 2 studios away.
So you know it's not quiet. Yeah, this is just, like I said, the wedges are just a little bit too big.
Terrence, if I did not have a giant Thor's hammer style mallet at home, what would you recommend instead?
Actually going to use the back of the hatchet until I was like, oh, that's going to be really loud, but then I lost it in the muting thing. You can also do this just with a hatchet, which is what I was going to do first. But this is being recorded and I didn't want to look like a fool any more than I already do. But you can also just shape it by you have a hatchet. Or, I mean, I hate to recommend this, but you can use one of these guys. And you can use a screwdriver. It does not have to be a dull chisel. It can be anything that you can use to split it apart. You can even use wood. So if you have a tapered piece of wood already handy from something else and you've got a little notch in the top that you can drive into, you can use wooden splits. It's not going to work for me right now, but it is absolutely a possibility. I'm not going to spend the rest of the time I have trying to get that off there since I've already got one. But we could use this slab to make our chair, and then I can just clean it up from there. I don't need wedges or anything. I can just decide I want that thin bit off the side. Oh, there's a knot in there. It's not fair. Then we can clean this up. This is fir, which is not my favorite. It's real splintery. But we can clean up the part that didn't break as cleanly. This is a spot where if you had something like a hand plane, you could spend time really making this into a board that you would want to sit on. But again, this is what was in the studio. I would not recommend using fir fur necessarily, unless you're particularly attached to fur. I thought I had a piece of white oak we were going to use, but it's not here. But out of that piece of firewood, we have a fairly decent slab, and you could sand this, you can clean it up with chisels and hand planes, but it's the beginning of making a little stool like this. So we can then look at that. We can take the legs we have, say, how do they relate to that? Can we put that together into a stool? I don't know where my little thing with the decorative bits go. It must have dropped off. Yeah.
I was gonna ask our audience here, is anybody not on the West Coast? Does anybody have more interesting woods where you are? We have a lot of fir and pine and these sort of general, ornamental garden trees and things like that here, but Oahu, nice. What the heck grows in
Where?
Hawaii, Terrence? What can we?
Koa in Hawaii, among other things. Where'd everybody go? Are we frozen?
No?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I thought you were in the middle of the question there and it went silent on me.
oh, so yeah, an orange tree and a lime tree. Okay, what about fruit trees, citrus trees in particular?
Citrus trees generally, I can't speak for all of them, citrus trees generally are a very dense hardwood. Lemon wood used to be used to make very fine little objects like chess pieces, boxes, things like that. It's very close grained, very dense. I'm assuming orange is similar, but I've never seen it used for anything.
The stuff you could carve with like a Dremel tool, that sort of thing.
Well, yes, although again, if you get it while it's green, if you're cutting a branch off a tree, you can cut maple with a knife by hand if it's fresh. But once it dries, it's going to be like a rock. Some of this that I was using earlier is maple. It's a fairly young maple, so it doesn't have the density of an older tree. But yeah, the citrus wood, all the fruit woods, by and large, are super dense. And they're both traditional and not traditional to use for furniture. Normally, you would not use a fruit tree because once you cut a fruit tree down, it no longer bears fruit. However, especially in North America, apple trees spread and fall. So they get wider and then a piece will break off. And that would be a fairly common, in this type of furniture, the sort of traditional twig furniture, you would take and split slabs out of the apple trunk like this to make arms for the chairs and things like that because it's super dense and has incredible color. Apple wood makes great furniture. Again, you have to resign yourself to the fact that you're killing the tree that lays the golden apples, as it were. But so I want to just quickly talk through this, but I'm totally up for answering questions as we go. When you start to figure out putting this together, I've added some angle to this, so it spreads more at the bottom than the top, which makes it more stable, but then we need to factor that into how it intersects with the plane of our piece of furniture as well. So there are a lot of ways to measure what that angle is. And I have the tool here on the bench, but there's another way to do it. I got myself 2 benches for this. I got the whole studio to myself. This is called a sliding T-bevel. It is an angle measuring tool. So it is a very traditional hand woodworking tool. And I put one side of it against my leg, and then I adjust it to where it meets the top. And that then should tell me the angle that that hole needs to go through there in order to go through there. So I can figure out what this angle is, and I can then drill the hole through at that angle. And I will have to, because these are both tapering toward the middle, I would want to do that before this sets up completely, when I can still flex this and slide those in there and then wedge them from the top. I wish we had time to get through putting something completely together, but hopefully you get enough ideas with this to start playing with stuff. The other way to do that you don't need the expensive tool. If I take my piece of wood and just draw on a piece of paper roughly what that is. It doesn't have to be exact, because if you then fold the paper along those lines, you get basically the same thing as that angle gauge. So I can take that, put it against there and go, oh, well, that's the angle I need to drill my hole at. And we can take that, just like we would with the angle gauge, put it against here and hold our drill at that angle as we go in. If you're doing compound angles, it gets a little crazier. So if we've got that angle with this measurement here, if we're going to also do that to give us even more spread on the chair, we would have built this basically already first, but not wedged it, because then it has to be assembled and wedged into a piece of furniture. That's where it gets a little crazy. That's why I say start with things that are 90 degrees. I automatically flared this out because I was acting out of habit. Once you know what you're doing, it can be flared in both directions, and you can still assemble the piece of furniture and then put all your wedges in, and then it will stay there. And you don't want to wedge too far, because the further out you go, the more stress you put on your joints. But something just out of 90 degrees makes a nice stable surface that you won't tend to tip over. So something in that range. So to do something like this, we would take our piece the way we looked at it there. We would take our angle gauge, which in this case is a piece of folded paper. You can also just hold this up next to it and hold the drill next to it and line it up and go. As I said, this is a no measurement style of furniture, or I would actually say it's a traditionally measuring style of furniture. It's not a tape measure, ruler, square sort of furniture. It is a, we're going to make this thing work sort of furniture. You got to find a drill bit that's about the right size. That looks a little small. I kind of wish I had a slightly bigger one, but maybe I don't. Spade bits. Those are those lucky little spade bits here. So I can look at it and go, all right, if I want it to be exactly the size of my current piece of wood, that's the one. If I want to taper down to a shoulder, that's probably better without me having to do too much work.
Terrence, could you hold that up again to closer to the camera? Sorry, you can see the.
So you can see that the edges of the drill bit are roughly a 1/4 inch smaller than the diameter of my piece of wood right now. And that's true on both of them, which again, these are random pieces of wood. That might not be true, so it's worth checking, which I wouldn't have if David hadn't stopped me there. With that said, they don't need to be the same size hole. So I don't have to find a middle ground between the two. I can make this a 3/4 and this a 5/8 if that's what I needed to do to make this work. But it's stuff to think about. So I'm just going to look at the angle I want that to go in at. And again, I can do it like that, or I can do it with my little gauge. I'm going to grab my drill. Actually, oh, that's too small. So we could do it with the brace and bit for fun, but that bit is too small. Because I'm going to be going all the way through this, and I'm not holding it up in the air, I want to put another piece of wood underneath it so I don't drill into my bench. Or what I like to do is put it over the opening of the vise, so it just drills down into space. But that can also splinter on you. So it's good to have another piece of wood underneath there that you're drilling into so that you don't put a hole in your bench or kitchen table, as I have also done. Let's not do that. I don't want to be the, yeah, he showed me this stuff and I was trying it out and I put a hole in the kitchen table guy. So I just use my piece of paper to line it up, and I'm not going to be obsessive about it. I'm not.
Just so you know, Terrence, it did just shut off your vault.
Definitely shut it off that time.
Yeah.
Nice. The nice thing about fur is it does smell like campfire. Just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That is what it smells like. So there's my hole going through my top. Now I'm going to have to measure. I'm going to put that on there. And now I do need something to make a mark with, because I need to know where this one goes through.
It's like the most precision part of the whole process, isn't it?
I really marked that out carefully and see how beautiful a not really circle that is. Precision. I am counting on the fact that my wood is still bendable. If my wood were not bendable at this point, this would not be necessarily the best way to do it. The piece of oak I'm drilling into is so much harder than the fir that the drill bit just stops at that point. So I've got my holes drilled. This is going in like that. So now I need to know how big these end up being. This is not the best bit for making that mark. This is a 1/2 inch drill bit. This is a 7/16 drill bit. So I'm going to use this to mark my ends. And then I just won't cut it quite to there. If that makes sense. Got my mark.
Just to clarify what's going on there, the spade bit can't do this nice tight circle because it has a huge point to it. It'll drill all the way in.
Yeah, and these are spade bits come in varying shapes. Some of them have little wings here. This just has a shallow angle. So it will draw a circle, but yeah, as David points out, that tip is huge. I'm basically drilling a 1/4 inch hole out of the end of my piece of wood at that point, instead of just this little mark I'm getting this way. Of course, I could trace the hole and not use my little trick. I could also just have a little plastic template that's got 1/2 inch hole drilled in it, or I could drill a 1/2 inch hole in a piece of paper. So many ways to go. Don't let yourself be limited by any kind of dogma.
I use my kid's compass all the time because I don't have one of my own. So I use his school compass that he's required to have for math class and never uses.
Nice. I have used a plastic kid's compass, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah.
I have some beautiful old dividers that were my dad's, but they never quite work right as a compass because they're actually dividers.
Yeah, somewhere I have my grandpa's engineering set that I've never actually touched for, usable purposes.
But it does look cool.
On display on a shelf in the garage.
Nice. That's true of most of my grandfather's tools as well.
Terrence, we have about 4 minutes left in our session. We did have one question about just looking at the at the sharpening a knife on a cup trick. But I also wanted to see if anybody had other questions or thoughts that they have, things you want to share, concerns that you might have about what we've covered so far.
So we're always around somewhere. My email address is on the website if you have other questions. If you have students who are looking to come and play in our shop, we're trying to get, wood shop is an area that we have not had open yet because all of my staff did not come back during their remote learning period here at the Craft Center. So we've got a couple of new staff members that we're training in, and we're trying to get the wood shop open again, starting with the bench room, which is where I am right now, which is our hand tool space, and then working our way into the power tool spaces as I have qualified staff. I've got one staff member who might be coming back for the summer or toward the end of this term, and then a couple more perhaps before fall. But in fall, I should hopefully have a full staff again. Our wood shop is open several hours a day, but it is one of our only studios that there has to be somebody on duty for you to use. not for what I'm doing. So if you're a student, or if we're open to the public again at some point, if you want to come in and make stuff in our studios, the bench room is available anytime we're open that there isn't a class going on. And you can come in here and do this sort of thing. Our power tool space, where we could have lots of other classes, and do have lots of other classes, is available only when there's a shop tech on duty, just to watch everybody's fingers and make sure everybody's following the same safety guidelines. What else am I missing there, David?
I think that's about it. Someone just mentioned I don't think I have any of these tools, but I'll definitely try something like this with the stuff that I have. Thanks for the demonstration. And I was just writing in response, don't hesitate to improvise on this stuff.
Nope, absolutely not.
Use the old kitchen knife if you can get it a little bit sharper. That's great.
They're really your friend.
The Harbor Freight tools, if you have a Harbor Freight where you live, they get you where you're going with a lot of this stuff. It's not ideal, but it's a great way to get started.
If you just have a hatchet, you can also do your mortises or do your tenons that way. If your hatchet's super sharp, like David's is right now, which mine is not at the moment, you can go actually really quickly that way. First piece of furniture I was ever taught to make was done with an axe. So yeah, lots of the tools don't need to be this fancy. You can get a cheap bushcraft knife off of Amazon for about $12. This is an actual wood carving knife, but again, not super expensive. It's about $20. Hi. David's bringing in a knife to show us.
No, I'm putting you on the spot for this one.
Oh, okay. I don't know how to do this.
I also didn't know how to do this yesterday when I tried it for the first time. It really isn't that simple. So this is just the underside of a coffee mug. You can see it's glazed here and glazed here, but pretty much they're always going to have this slightly rougher portion here that's raw unglazed ceramic.
Well, in this case, it's porcelain, so that's part of why it's working so well.
Yep.
So yeah, you're just drawing the knife at the existing angle of the edge.
And the question was, how do you find that angle?
Yeah, I feel for it. So there's a bevel on there, not the big flat, but the bevel, the secondary bevel there. You're going to rest that on the edge of the coffee cup, and you kind of rock it with your hand until you feel it sit flat along that surface, and then draw it across the surface right at that angle. I've never done this, by the way. He should be doing this for you. But it is remarkably sharp for that trick. I think it would definitely depend on what kind of coffee cup it is, but this was a freebie that came from Crest Kilns when we bought a kiln, and it works just fine. Huh. I'll be darned. Learn something new every day.
I know. I was so excited by that one.
Start now.
Tiffany, did you want to lead us out? Did you have anything else to share before we wrap up? I can see people are ready to go.
I've just learned so much. This has been so awesome. Thank you both. Yes, just thank you. And for those that are still with us, I cannot encourage the Craft Center enough. Please share this with your students. Please encourage them. When I first started on campus, I just waltzed in, happened to meet David, and he gave me a full tour. Everything from glasswork and glass blowing to textiles to paint. I mean, the space is phenomenal. And between the studio options and the class options, there really is something for everyone. So I can't encourage the Craft Center enough. Feel free to email. My deck is at uoregon.edu. If you have any questions, I'm happy to send you links. If you have questions I can't answer, I am volunteering David. I will send them to him and let him answer. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for coming to play. This is what I love doing.
And Tiffany, thanks for inviting us to be a part of this. It's great. I hope some of you will be joining us also maybe tomorrow night for our Foiled Again workshop. If not, we will be looking at doing more virtual workshops over the summer. So please keep an eye out.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.